welcome back. We are delighted that you are a part of this second annual symposium education here at Texas A&M University Commerce. My name is Lavelle Hendricks, and I have the distinct honor and privilege of moderating this second panel, Healing Through Knowledge and Humility. Our panelists, Dr. Julia Ballenger, who's our Regents professor. And for those who don't know, the Regents professor is the highest academic honor you can obtain through the Texas A&M University system. Dr. Ballenger is also a professor in the Department of Education and Leadership. Jayson Douglas, who holds his master's degree as the director of the Office of Intercultural Engagement and Leadership on campus. Dr. Kriss Kemp-Graham is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership. And of course, Ms. Sandi Patton, who is our director of the Office of Student Disability Services here. Again, this panel will deal with healing through knowledge and humility. Thank you so much. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hendricks. And we are happy to be here this morning. And it is delightful to see so many participants. I'm going to begin with definition of terms. And you know, when you think about knowledge and information, I equate that to power. Information is power. Knowledge is power. Knowledge allows us to view concepts, to view issues from different perspectives. So we're going to focus on healing through knowledge and humility. Now, there are many, many definitions of humility, and it just depends upon the, I would say, the research that you chose to use as your source. So this panel, the members of this panel decided to look at an overview of all of the literature. We looked at the theological review from a Christianity perspective. We looked at the philosophical view of humility. We also noted the psychology, a perception of humility, and we've just kind of framed our discussion coming from these many different perspectives. As you can see, we begin with that humility is a Latin word, humilius, which literally means low. But as educators, you know, we don't take the first definition of a term. We look really significantly at many, many definitions. So we are reviewing, talking about humility from different perspectives. I will say that from the philosophical perspective, Kant, who is one of my favorite philosophers, states that humility also is looked upon as lowliness and self-abasement. But he said those really are not virtues. That is what has happened in our society. You know, slaves were oppressed and they were abased. And so therefore, they looked at humility from a different perspective because of them being within the context of a slave. So it is situational and it is contextual. Some of our characteristics talks about it as a human virtue, that it can be a positive human virtue. We also are looking at humility as the crest of human excellence, somewhere between arrogance and lowliness. And I know that quite well because my mother had to talk to me about sometime my less than humility characteristics, and certainly some of my arrogance. I had to grow into humility, and I'm probably still growing. Next slide, please. When we think about the modern definitions of humility, there are several different definitions. One has to do with the ability of a person to really capture their strengths as well as their weaknesses. Another characteristic of humility is the ability to respect others' perspective and to be open to one's limitations. And one other characteristic of humility is the importance of making an accurate assessment of one's capabilities, while at the same time realizing that we may lack in some area. Therefore, it is so important to note that humility really does take an accurate self-assessment, and that it is situational. So if you could, you did change the slide. I'm looking at different monitors. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. So one other focus on humility is the authentic humility. Morris et al. States that we are not talking about self-abasement, nor are we referring to overly positive self-regard, but there are three connected, distinct dimensions of humility. And there are many, many more, but from the research that I've gathered, one is self-awareness, openness, and transcendence. It is important, as I stated before, that we must be aware of our abilities and our limitations. We must be open to the fact that we don't know all things about all issues, but that we are open to learning new things. And the other component we look at is being the lowliness aspect, or rising above that to transcendence. So what we're saying about transcendence is that we know that there is a higher person or belief or whatever your higher thing is, that we are not there and we do not expect to be there. Could we change slides? Looking at humility from a leadership and management perspective, which is where I've done most of my research, one of our management experts states that, he is Ken Blanchard, he states that people with humility do not think less of themselves. They just think of themselves less. You know, it's not all about them, but it's about others and others' perspective. Next slide. And so we have to focus on cultural humility, because in our session, the panel that went before us did an excellent job in discussing the various dimensions, knowledge, skills, and dispositions related to cultural interdependency. When I speak of cultural humility, I don't say, okay, we bring on a concept of cultural humility and we close the door to the concept of cultural competencies. No, that is not what I am saying. I am saying both of these concepts we need them both. We need competency in culture, and we need to demonstrate humility from the various culture. So when we talk about cultural humility, these two concepts are juxtaposed, culture and humility. And it really is looking at understanding self and understanding others. That is critical. We began, as in cultural, relative, responsive behaviors, we begin with ourselves, getting a good understanding of ourselves. And then we try to understand others' culture. We recognize our own prejudices and our own cultural misperceptions. We engage in continuous self-reflection, self-critique, and critical consciousness, Fiera talks about critical consciousness, and that is so important that we always step back and critique ourselves, our knowledge, our behaviors. And then we challenge power differentials in working relationships in organizations. What does that look like, Jayson, when we challenge power differentials? Jayson has his. Well, basically, one way, and while he's getting ready, one way that we challenge power differentials in working relationships in organization is that we question what people say and what they are doing. And we ask for research base, we ask for multiple sources of evidence and not just someone's opinion. And we say, where are you going with this? And why are you doing this? Now, we question people, and some people may think, well, Julia, does that mean, yeah, it means you question the people with the power. And why can't we empower all? Jayson, do you see another perspective that you would like to share?
Absolutely. I was having some trouble with my audio, but I think that when we talk about the challenge of power differentials in supervision, it's really important that we think about identity conscious supervision and what that looks like. As a supervisor, I can't supervise each one of my teammates the same way. I have to specifically look at the different identities that they hold, and I have to recognize how their identities intersect with each other and be specific in my approach. I have to tailor my communication style. I have to recognize how I'm speaking to them in different facets and how they receive criticism and feedback. I also have to make sure how, especially taking cultural humility is about also knowing what's going on in society and what's going on in the world and how that affects them showing up to the workplace. Because consciously, if we have an ongoing project, then we might have a deadline that might be, let's say, on Monday. And if I'm not thinking consciously about, hey, this just happened in this person's life, or this is what's going on in society that's probably affecting this individual on an individual basis, then that to me is culturally ignorant, right? And we have to make sure that we're taking a culturally humble approach and really saying, hey, I'm coming to you in this way. And how we navigate through those specific situations really centers that individual's identity. And that's what creates that cultural humility.
Very good. Two more points and we'll move forward to Dr. Kriss Kemp-Graham. But here are 2 points that I think are so essential in understanding that you look at humility, culture, humility from different perspectives. From the institutional perspective, you may see that things look a little differently than from the individual perspective. And so it is so important to understand that cultural humble practices is important. And it does require us to be respectful of others. And that means all of us. We all should respect others' perspective in which they're coming from. And in order to respect others' perspectives and others' culture, then we need to be culturally aware of other cultures. As Dr. May Jane talked about China and their monoculture perspective. And then she comes to the United States and she sees our diversity and that we come from different perspectives. And she's been here for 20 years, so she certainly understands the differences. And I'm sure that she finds herself sometimes in 2 worlds, one with her Chinese background and then as an American. So it is important that we take the time to learn about others and that we work collaboratively, building relationships. And that is about our attitude that we must take of, we don't know it all. And yes, we can learn from others. Dr. Graham, talk to us about trauma and some of the current traumatic conditions in the world.
Sure. And so just almost piggybacking off of what Jayson said, as well as the prior panelists, when we're talking about trauma and how we have this in your face view of the world because of the various medium, we have to begin to look at what's happening and then how it impacts us, how it impacts our colleagues. And I'm so glad that Jayson spoke about how that impacts how he supervises with having to take a differentiated approach. I think with all these slides, they represent trauma that we faced here in Commerce, over in Greenville, New York City, with COVID, the Stop the Asian Hate, we had the, George Floyd and so many others, Say Her Name, Black Lives Matter, the babies being, taken from mothers at the borders. I mean, we can go on. And also it's important that we not forget when we keep talking about trauma are our veterans and our veteran families and what they experience. And also 9/11. And although many people say that so long ago, when you think about just people and their traumas and where they come from, on 9/11, I was on my way to the towers. And because they had a wonderful shopping area at the bottom, at the lower level, where you just get off the train and go shop and jump back on. And if you're up north, that's what you want to do. You're not going to drive into the city unless you have to. And something just told me, just don't go over there, just jump and just get off in Jersey City and go to that mall. And that's what I did. And so every time 9/11 comes around, I think about just, me not being in those towers. I think about having to return to school and having to inhale so much of that smoke that was so much in the air, and then wondering how that impacted me. So we have to understand each other and what our experiences are. And culturally, they're more than just hairstyles and food and clothing, right? It's also understanding our histories, the good things, but also the traumatic things. And this also applies to, like I said, adults. Having worked as an administrator in Newark, I was always dealing with trauma on a daily basis. So I knew how to respond to my children, right? Because I know they were acting out for a reason other than they're just bad. But then that also translates over to dealing with colleagues. And because we are adults, it does not mean that we have not, we don't have unresolved issues as pertains to trauma. Next slide, please. You might just have to just physically, okay. And so as Dr. Ballenger spoke about, we as a team, as a committee, we looked at the term humility because we have to first have knowledge before we can move to healing. And so what does it mean to have humility? And oftentimes we think of it in a negative connotation, so that you want me to walk around with a bowed head and believe that I'm below someone. And that's absolutely not the definitions that I researched, okay? And so I looked at humility from a theological, philosophical, and psychological perspective from, of course, the empirical research base. And one of the things, one of the key elements is just an accurate assessment of one's abilities and achievements, not looking at low self-esteem or self-deprecation, but just having, just an accurate perspective. And when we look at it from a cultural lens, just having an accurate assessment of others' contributions, right? So I might think that my culture is great, but I should not believe that my culture is better or any worse. We all contribute to the greater good. Ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, imperfections, gaps in knowledge, and limitations. And I think that is so important because when you don't know something, you should ask and do so respectfully. So I am not an expert on all things that have to do with the Black culture, right? But if somebody has a question, they could ask, very privately and not publicly. Also, I've done this a million times as a faculty member and speaking to my colleagues and wanting to know more about their culture. And so it's okay to acknowledge that, you have a gap in the knowledge, and we are all growing to be more culturally competent. having an openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice. And so being open to saying, well, you know what, I thought XYZ about this particular group, but now I see that it's different because we are human and we are all flawed. And so just being open to receiving something that's contradictory information. But as Dr. Ballenger said, if you're going to contradict the statement, then you need to bring me the receipts, as the kids say, bring me the empirical evidence. That's what we say as researchers, but the children will say the receipts. So bring Dr. Kemp-Graham the receipts. And if you can bring the receipts, I'm going to be more than willing to consider a opposing view, but I'm not willing to consider necessarily your view because it's your opinion. I can respect it. I don't have to receive it, but bring me some proof. Okay, next slide. Okay. Yes, keeping one's abilities and accomplishments, one's place in the world in perspective, seeing oneself as just one person in a larger scheme of things. And I struggled with this for a minute because I thought as we are raising our children, I tell my girls all the time, you know, you have Black girl magic, you are awesome, you can be whatever you want, you are a beautiful princess, you are a beautiful queen. But then as I am encouraging these attitudes and dispositions in my African-American children, how then does the world see them? And so when they go and find their place or seek their place in the world, and I have them thinking that they are these awesome, you know, queens, beautiful queens, knowledgeable queens, you have a lot to offer the world. What I also must do as a mother to also instill in them, you're a part of a bigger picture, okay? And so yes, you are a queen, but you should be standing among other queens. And so I think that's where the humility comes in. Know your value and know your worth, but see yourself in the grand scheme of things, that there are others that share the same awesomeness as you do, okay? So you're not better, you're not worse, but definitely, you know, accurately see where, you know, your place in the world. Have a relatively low self-focus, a forgetting of the self while recognizing that one is but one part of the larger universe. And that just kind of goes back to, you know, this me versus being part of, you know, a team and understanding that you are part of the greater good. So consider the greater good before you consider just yourself. And an appreciation of value of all things, as well as the many different ways that people and things can contribute to our world. Once again, the whole messaging that I received through my research is that we are part of a collective and knowing your place in the world, but having respect for all things. And there is no superior in terms of culture and races. And I think that when we apply this, as I believe we were asked to speak from a faculty perspective, is to keep these things in mind, that no one's better, no one's worse. Learn more about your peers, but also learn more about your students. And I always tell a story when I came from New York and I came down here, one of my students had to show a pig or a cow or something. And I said, what is that? You know, and then he explained to me and I was like, wow, it's very, very interesting because that was not part of my culture, was not part of my upbringing. And so initially I did have a negative connotation, like, oh my gosh, that's an animal. How could you show an animal, you know, beyond a beautiful horse or something? But once it was explained to me, then I was more open, you know, to understanding where I was. I'm in Texas, and this is very much rooted in Texas culture. And so acknowledging my own ignorance, but also willing to learn. And that's what's important. I can say, I don't know, you know, about that, but I can learn more about it. And I think, and that's what we have to do in terms of healing. We can't heal if we don't have knowledge, and we don't have knowledge if we don't seek it out or ask, you know, for it. And it's so important that we understand that the traumas that we all have experienced, and especially understanding how we can re-traumatize our peers, re-traumatize our students when we don't understand what's going on. And so you should just take some time and some effort to get to know your peers, get to understand, you know, where they come from. And I think that from there, we can begin to start the healing, because it's okay again to say, I just don't know. And maybe I spoke out of turn, or I invited you to Thanksgiving dinner and I didn't realize that you don't celebrate Thanksgiving. And so it was not meant to offend you. It's just part of how I was raised, and maybe I didn't know. And so it's just becoming more culturally aware of everyone that we come into contact with. Next slide.
Okay, Jayson.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Graham. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the healing justice model, and I want to thank Dr. Ballenger for sharing the literature with me this week surrounding this model. Since sharing that, I've really gotten engulfed within the material there. It is an amazing, amazing model, and I'll be able to share that hopefully with you all in the comment section. But this model was developed by a community of scholars who really in the literature tells us that the healing justice framework really identifies how we holistically respond and intervene through intergenerational trauma and violence. And for today's conversation, I want us to really think about the term healing. And as we define that, I want us to think about that definition as an ongoing process about how we mend, but not only mending that within ourselves, but also how we build power, resistance, and resilience to transform those systems of oppression. And those systems of oppression are things that we think about on the daily. So classism, sexism, racism, anti-Semitism, ableism, and all of those things alike. Healing justice is in the center of this model, and it's in that center for a reason. It's about how we truly investigate how we transition from harm to healing. And that's something that Dr. Graham had spoke about a little bit earlier. And it's about how we create these safe spaces or mechanisms of support for one another, but also for ourselves. Because oftentimes as practitioners of this work, we're boots on the ground in our own activism as scholar activists or scholar practitioners, or whatever we want to call ourselves, but we're so invested in taking care of other people that we forget about taking care of ourselves. And that is so important, because if we don't show up for ourselves, we can't show up for anybody else. That's not going to do us any good. It's a restorative process, and we must be consistently plugged into that. It's about that radical healing justice. So bottom line, it's a daily thing. It's about how we tackle these complex issues of grief and trauma through injustice, through police failures. It's about all the things that we see on TV, gender violence, the Haitian migration that's currently going on right now. It's about occupying stolen land from the indigenous or Native Americans. It's about all the bones that we're finding in Canada, and all of a sudden nobody knows where they're coming from and don't want to hold anybody accountable. It's about how we think about all of these things embodied within ourselves. Next, we have collective action. And sometimes we don't think about the collective we. We don't think about how we can galvanize our power together and figure out how we can heal together. Sometimes healing is about going to your neighbor and saying, hey, you hurt me. Can we talk about that? What does that look like? It's not an individual action, it's a collective action. It's about how do we have this action in relationship with other people? You know, it's about how we're able to come together and formulate a space of healing. So sometimes we do that in therapy on an individual one-to-one basis. Sometimes that's in a group of just your sisters or your brothers or your community, whatever that looks like for you.
We may have had a minor technical issue with Mr. Douglas. We'll try to get him back on, Dr. Ballenger, shortly. We'll try to get him back on.
Right. And while he is getting back on, let me continue with this. You know, when you see radical healing, don't look at the term radical and think negative. It just means that we're talking about a complete healing, a transformation. You know, there's just so many oppressive conditions in the world. The pandemic only really brought our attention to the inequities that exist in the health profession, the inequities that exist in the education field, and the lack of knowledge that people have. So this is an excellent symposium. Knowledge is critical. And I would say it probably may be very close to the top thing about healing, is to understand where you are and what you need to do next. And this healing justice model was developed by a group of Black scholars and from the field of Jayson is coming back on. It was developed by a group of Black scholars, and it is something that it takes all of us. It's not just about one person in isolation, but it's a collaborative effort, building those relationships to help each other heal. Jayson, you may move forward. I got you. I was talking while you were getting back on.
I don't think we've clearly got Mr. Douglas back on yet, Dr. Ballenger.
Okay.
Okay, I think I just got unmuting privileges. Okay, perfect.
Okay,
I apologize for the technical difficulties there, but I think that where we left off was talking about that collective action and about how we are all engaged in that process and galvanizing the power of our strength and coming together and recognizing it's not something that we do just by ourselves, but it's something that we need to do with one another. It's a community support. It's a communal affair in action. The next one that I want us to talk about a little bit is about how we come together. And like Dr. Graham was talking about, is that we need to be very intentional about how we create these spaces. And these trauma-informed spaces have to be a space of safety. We have to recognize that when we are creating these trauma-informed spaces, it has to be a very deliberate, very intentional opportunity where we're not re-traumatizing individuals. So what does that look like for ourselves? For instance, if we take things that are affecting our students that we know most of them have been exposed to, or even some of them have been exposed to, and then create experiences where we re-traumatize them. What does that look like? Many of our students who come to our campus oftentimes are facing guidance counselors, teachers, people off the street that said that they won't make it. They won't amount to anything. And then we put them in these spaces where we do intentionally create spaces where it's several barriers and limitations to progress and success for them. So make it that they won't make it. That's trauma in itself. How do we then create spaces of intentionality where we want them to heal, where we're motivating them, when we're empowering them? It has to be fully supportive in all of those things, intentional by design, by the physical landscape of the space that promotes safety, well-being, and most important, healing. It's a space that empowers their identity, their value, and their worth. Next, we have radical healing. Radical healing is grounded in the social justice component about how we lift as we climb, and most importantly, how do we lift the needs of all people, including those that are most marginalized by society today. It's a holistic approach that we engage in all components of the mind, the body, and the spirit. So with radical healing for me, that means that I need to be very intentional about my self-care. And my self-care is not about just, oh, I work from 8:30 to 5, and then I go home and then I sit on the couch. No, that means that sometimes I need to plug out because I'm on my computer and I'm engaging in the world. I'm checking what's going on CNN. I'm getting my CNN updates on my phone. I'm scrolling through my Facebook and my Twitter feeds, and I'm seeing things that are constantly talking about Black men this, or Caribbean migrants this, or LGBTQ people this. All of my salient identities are constantly being scrutinized and they're under attack. And sometimes that means I need to plug out from the world. I need to plug out from sometimes my students who find me as a space to vent, to be, to be a person where they can sow into and to talk to. And that's great. But that's also meaning that I'm indulging in that secondary trauma. I'm living vicariously through their trauma and I'm receiving it all. Radical healing for me means I need to plug out and I need to not read that scholarly literature that I'm so passionate about. I need to say, like, how can I get into some fiction and read about some fairies or something that's gonna make me happy? I don't know. Or how can I sit on my porch and figure out, like, how can I fill up my bucket again so I can be of use and support to someone else? So to wrap this all up, it's about making sure that the healing justice component in the middle is that central component. And it has to be something that's individual, but it also has to be about not only how we're showing up for others, but how we're showing up for ourselves. Next slide, please. So I know we talked about radical healing so much, and we talked about the healing justice model and talking about how do we create these settings of empowerment. Just really briefly, I'm sure that you can see how many of these things are interconnected. The healing justice model creates these spaces where you can see that shared leadership is very much so connected to agency. When we talk about collective action, it's very much so rooted in the meaningful relationships and that there's multiple roles and partners integrated into that experience. When we talked about trauma-informed spaces, it's really important to create that setting of empowerment or empowering setting. It's about how do we facilitate peer support? What does your network look like? Right? What does those people look like? What does your community look like? How is it meaningful? How are we engaging in those experiences with each other? And how do we really create radical healing? So pretty much that wraps that up. Thank you for bearing with me through the technical difficulties.
Thank you. Sandi?
To talk about how we as an institution can foster humility in our students and why it's important for us as individuals, for our students, for our institution, and for our society. First, I think it's important that we understand and learn that in order to really embrace humility, we have to recognize that each of us is, in fact, only a finite and fallible human being that's a tiny, tiny part of the vast universe, and that we each have a limitation on our perspective and an incomplete view of the whole of the world itself. There's been a lot of talk of various cultures that people have shared with us today, which I find intriguing and wonderful because I really like to experience different cultures. And I think it's important that we each pause and recognize that the world is full of wonderful and diverse individuals with various ethnicities, various gender identities, various abilities, various races, and various cultures. When our students arrive on our campus, they bring with them their own personal, rich cultural history, and they represent all of these different identities that we've been talking about. It's important as an institution for us to promote mutual respect for each individual, each of our students, and the culture that each of our students bring. That is a part of prong one, is to really foster the respect for the diversity and helping the students as they are here heal from trauma, as we ourselves as staff and faculty and others in the institution model humility for our students and help them develop into individuals who better understand and embrace the significance of humility. The second prong is understanding that each of us are only one among a host of other morally relevant beings whose interests are just as legitimate and worthy as our own. Just because someone comes from a different culture, a different religion, has a different belief system, it does not mean that their beliefs and their culture is less important, less significant, or less worthy of our own. We do serve a diverse community. And while our own personal views and perspectives are important, and we should always be mindful of those, we also need to be mindful and respectful of the views and perspectives of others because they are just as legitimate and worthy as our own. It is important that I point out as we talk about these two prongs of humility that research has indicated that this particular concept of humility may in fact be unique specifically to the Western cultures, including the United States. So if we are going to talk about cultures and communities beyond the Western cultures that we've been mentioning, it's important to realize that some of our students are going to bring to the table a different understanding of what humility means. If we want to foster that humility among everyone, we as an institution need to step up and first clearly define what exactly we mean by humility in a way that is embraces everyone's beliefs and values, and understand why we need to share with our students that humility is an important aspect for all of us if we are going to heal our society. Now, why is that an important aspect? Why do we need to even be talking about humility? I really found it interesting as I studied Ashton and Lee's research, the correlations that were found between specific characteristics. So for example, they did research and found a correlation very strong between honesty and humility. One of the reasons that this particular correlation is important is that this particular correlation has been found to be negatively correlated with behaviors such as manipulativeness, displaced aggressions, vengefulness, a sense of social dominance, and other counterproductive behaviors. We know as a society, if we are going to grow, if we are going to heal, if we are going to find ways to address the trauma that each of us has experienced in various ways, these type of behaviors have no place in our society. We also found in doing this particular research that there were positive correlations related to humility and honesty with the characteristics of integrity, cooperation, and other morally relevant capacities. These are the kinds of traits we want to actually foster in our students and in ourselves, in our institution, and in our society. If we work together and foster the development of humility among our students and our community, we have the opportunity to impact within society a decrease in aggression, in the prevalence of social dominance, in behaviors related to vengeance, and we have the opportunity to increase the prevalence of integrity, cooperative behaviors, and morally relevant concepts and abilities. Additionally, in another research that I studied with Blacklaw et al., these differences in honesty and humility were found again to be negatively related. And so we want to know, in order to promote the positive, what do we do about that? It's one thing for us to be here on the symposium and talk about humility and healing if we don't have some pragmatic strategies that we walk away with that we can use and begin to make a difference. One person, one student, one individual at a time. One approach that has been found to be very positive is the development of new writing therapy tools using multimodality exercises that are specifically designed to promote the humility, for fostering humility, and to help our children and our adolescents and our young adults develop humility and embrace it. Research has also been done to determine how people who have been evaluated and found to be either high in humility or low in humility, how do they write? How do they think? How do they behave in ways that help them either develop that humility or not have it embodied within themselves at all? So research has been done where they have actually studied the writings of individuals who have been deemed to be high in humility based on evaluating those individuals. And it's also been done in using those same kinds of words that are used by the writings of the individuals who are high in humility, by using the types of phrases that are used by individuals who are high in humility, and then turning around and having writing assignments for their own students and teaching them how to incorporate the verbiage, the language, the philosophy behind the writings of those who are high in humility. We all know that words do make a difference. How we express ourselves, how we address other people, how we communicate one-on-one, and how we communicate with other cultures. Here is an idea that we as an institution can look at, and a strategy that we can embrace that might begin to make a difference in the humility, both starting at the individual level of the student, but with the goal being to impact one student at a time, our society, and one student at a time, embracing that humility and learning as a society through humility how to heal one another and how to heal ourselves. It is important for those of you who are researchers out there to know that more research is needed on this topic. So perhaps some of these writing activities could be something that you could explore with your students and add to the research and literature. Thank you.
Thank you. Some of the recommendations. So future research on bringing humility to leaders, faculty, staff, and students may examine the creation and application of humility by these key people as part of a critical component in their preparation program. I think that as our committee or our panel was working through the content for this exercise and today's discussion, we thought about what does this look like? And we thought about not just creating a space of conversation where we're talking amongst ourselves or talking to an audience, but really creating a list of deliverables and what is our call to action. Some of the skills or things that I think are important for us to take away is something that I share oftentimes with my students and colleagues alike, is the concept of WAIT as an acronym for why am I talking or why am I not talking? As we think about what cultural humility looks like, or humility and knowledge and that healing process, sometimes when we're in spaces, toxic or non-toxic, sometimes we take up too much space because we're talking too much and we're not allowing ourselves to amplify the voices of those most marginalized. Or sometimes we're engaging in a space where we shouldn't be talking because we need to make sure that we're providing space for others, or we need to take the time out for ourselves and heal because there's just so much chaos and activity going on. Sometimes it's worth it not to engage, and that's okay because that's a part of radical self-care, radical healing that we just talked about in that healing justice model. Sometimes, and that transitions or segues into that taking space or making space. Sometimes it's okay for us to take a step back and say, I'm not going to be involved in this. Or sometimes that means I need to step in and advocate for someone else, right? Sometimes it's common that we're in a space where we like to overtalk people, and sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional, but we need to take space. Sometimes the space that we occupy is a very radical form of justice. It's a very radical form of healing by occupying that space or not occupying that space. But it's also important that we take in the knowledge in that healing process by assuming good intentions. If we're always assuming that people are going to do something intentionally malicious to us, that's not a part of healing. We need to assume good intentions of others. And even if that something was to harm you, then you need to be able to have that conversation, or sometimes it's okay not to have that conversation as well. Also ask for clarity and leaning into discomfort. That's also a recommendation of this group as well, because we have to be vulnerable. We have to be able to take off that rough skeleton or exterior and lean into spaces where we're uncomfortable and most vulnerable in order for us to heal. Some of those calls to action that we came up with is we said, how are we integrating this framework that we're talking about and so excited about? How are we integrating that into our work? I think about the group that I'm a part of, Taffy, and the work that we do with all of our students, our faculty and staff across campus. How are we thinking about how we're taking care of ourselves? Because we're constantly taxing ourselves in this work, but we're never thinking about how are we engaging in that radical healing? How are we thinking about creating trauma-informed environments and spaces? How are we thinking about what does healing justice look like for ourselves? I also challenge that to the Latino Faculty and Staff Association, to the different committees and groups across this campus, because we have to recognize that we are a system, we are an institution, which is a system of higher education. And what are we then doing to integrate this very valuable model into the vast amount of committees, of offices and departments within this institution? This has to be a central component in order for us to make it. We can't be in a space where we're just wanting to survive, but we have to be in a space where we're willing to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Douglas. Thank you so much, Dr. Graham, Ms. Sandi, and of course, Dr. Ballenger. You guys are truly experts in this area. However, we do have a few minutes left, and there are some questions that have come forward. And the first one is to you, Dr. Graham. The writer states that humility is an excellent opportunity so that we can learn and understand one another. However, does humility lead towards inclusion on a college campus, that of both social and cultural justice?
What was the last part that you said about social justice?
Does it lead towards inclusion and social and cultural justice on a college campus?
I believe absolutely so, because once you then view yourself in a broader context, right, and begin to accept everyone as being valued, then I think it definitely moves into that social justice and inclusiveness, because perhaps at one point you were not inclusive. Maybe you were not a social justice leader looking to dismantle policies and practices that negatively impact marginalized groups. So learning more, acknowledging that there's a gap in which getting to know more about what's happening with not just your peers, but even with students. And then, as Jayson talked about, sometimes you have to advocate and sometimes you have to step back. But knowing your skill set and what you're best at and what you could be most effective with, I think should be a determining factor in terms of your advocacy. But absolutely, the more we learn about ourselves and understand that we're supposed to, in terms of humility, value everyone. And so if I value you, then I'm going to want to include you, or I'm going to be an ally if I see that you're not included, to do what I can to make sure that you are included, to speak up. So absolutely, I believe if we adopt these tenets and we really believe it and be intentional and reflective, it will happen. Yes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ballenger, a question for you from our attendees. With all of the microaggressions that marginalized groups experience on a college or university campus, how are you keeping yourself safe, healthy, and whole?
That is an excellent question. I wonder sometimes if I am. Okay, now we'll get to the answer. Three things that I will briefly say that's helping me to keep myself safe, healthy, and whole. One thing personally is adhering to the knowledge base of scientists as related to the pandemic. I read the research and I read multiple sources of research, and I adhere to those standards so that I can keep myself safe. Keeping myself whole. A way for me to keep myself whole is knowing that there is something in my life that is greater than who I am. And that something connects me to reality. And I always say to people, as when someone gets upset, I will say, people sometimes do not realize what they do not know. And you've heard that being said. They do not realize what they do not know. I do not take things personally. I do not attack the person because the person is being honest and letting me know how she or he really feels. And I welcome that. And then safe, hold, and the other is reading for me. Reading keeps me informed. And then another thing, it is being of service to all mankind, which is part of my motto in my sorority. The more you give and the more you help out others, that's what makes me feel whole, is paying it forward, giving, and being of service to all people.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mr. Douglas, one of the attendees stated that you described an excellent philosophy of accommodating those with different backgrounds that you supervise. However, how can you be assured that that flexible approach is both fair and equitable?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. I think that that's part of the getting to know those that you supervise, but it has to be, it's always going to be fair and equitable, because if you're maintaining this intentional approach, it's intentional across the board, recognizing that there are varying identities that those that you supervise hold most salient or most important to them, finding out what's important to them, because you don't really know your supervisees if you don't know what identities are most important to them or how they're navigating the world. And that's a problem in itself. But what we will talk about addressing the question is about how do we then say, okay, this individual is navigating the world through this lens. How can I speak to this lens? And although our lenses might not be the same, it's okay to share our differences in our lenses, but this is the way that I need to communicate with them and how they appreciate and find value in being communicated with and worked with. And this is how I value being communicated with and worked with. It's about sharing those mutual expectations through those varying lenses. That is what shows the equity. That is what shows value. And that's what shows fairness. Oftentimes we get tied up in how is this equitable and how is this not equitable. If you're taking the same approach, that's where the equity lies.
Thank you. The question is to Ms. Sandi and Dr. Graham, but Ms. Sandi first. When and how should you draw the line between appreciating another culture's viewpoint and then calling out that voice that is intolerant, bigoted, or hateful? Ms. Patton.
I think that if someone is intolerant and bigoted and hateful, my first approach would be tender education. I am going to, as Jayson so eloquently said before, assume that this person is behaving that way, not because they have bad intentions, but maybe because they don't know and understand. If that kind of behavior persists and continues, then I'm going to be a person that stands up for social justice, and I'm going to clarify my feelings on that and let that person know. And I've had to do that in the past. I've had to tell a friend, I'm sorry, but I find your comments to be rude and bigoted. And you are in my home. And if you are going to talk in that manner about other people, many of whom, just because they're not the same culture as me or the same race as me, I consider to still be very good friends. I'm not going to tolerate that behavior, and I'm going to let them know that. But I think that the first step always is in assuming that perhaps this person has not had the rich opportunity to be educated on the value of other cultures and the fact that through humility, we have to remember, we each are but one small grain of sand on the beach. And every other grain of sand is necessary to be on the beach in order for it to even exist.
Thank you. Dr. Graham?
Yes, and I share this story all the time. When I first came to Texas and I got to know Dr. Ballenger, she said, "You don't know where you are." And I thought to myself, yes, I do. I'm in Texas. She said, "You don't know about East Texas." And I'm saying, like, who cares, right? And it was about understanding the culture of East Texas, which was so different than what I had experienced in the North. So once again, and Dr. Ballenger, and I would say, "Can you believe this person said X, Y, and Z to me?" And she said, "Kriss, they don't know what they don't know. And if this has always been their experience, and this is how they've always viewed Black women or Black people or people from the North, they don't know what they don't know." So again, going back to the model that Jayson, believe shared is don't, or I think Sandi did, don't automatically assume that the comment was meant to hurt, which I did for a long time, right? And it just felt like all these microaggressions. And so then you learn to speak up. And as Sandi said, you educate. And I know that a lot of Black people feel, why do we have to educate others about us, right? Because it becomes a burden. But if we're going to get along and you know that you've offended me, I've got to educate you. And so it's done very professionally. And when I experienced it again from a supervisor, and it was so hurtful to me, the comments that were made, I went and got an article and shared it with that supervisor, who then read it and apologized. But then what the supervisor did was made that part of our agenda for our faculty meeting, to say, this is the wrong I did. And and what Kriss did was educate me by sharing an empirically research-based article. And she said that we have to be careful and mindful of the words that we use and we say, because we are different. But it had to, one, come from me, right? From not being offended all of the time, thinking that there was intentionality to hurt me or disrespect me, but then two, educating that person or those persons, or, draw the line. You can always pull somebody aside and say, what you said was offensive to me, and this is why it was offensive, like that. Just educating people. Some people are going to receive it and some aren't, but I would say don't take it from the negative perspective all the time, because it really isn't. They don't know what they don't know, especially if they've been raised in these homogenous communities and they're learning to get along with others. So be a little patient.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Ballenger, some think that humility is a sign of weakness. How do you perceive that humility is viewed from different cultural perspectives?
I would say yes. Humility is viewed from different cultural perspective as a weakness. It's perceived as a lowly position. And because I know that my family members, and especially the older generation, as a child, I would have to very nicely explain to some of the elders in our family, do you know what you're saying? Do you realize? And they didn't know. When you have a generation and you live long enough so that you have a generation that is very, very close to the slavery. My grandmother's grandmother was enslaved. So that's just a different form of humility that the slaves, and they used that in order to get over. That was their way of advancing, and they did it beautifully. We need to learn from them. So yeah, I would agree with you that yes, that's going to be a lot of people's perception of humility, but that's why knowledge is so important. Because you can say, but I know a different definition. And this is the definition that I espouse.
And that is actually why we took it upon ourselves to really do research and come up with different definitions to share in this presentation. Because as I mentioned at the onset of my portion, what I presented came from a almost exclusively Western culture perspective. And if I were to be sharing that part of my presentation with individuals from an Eastern culture, their perception of what I'm saying would be very, very different from sharing it with those from a similar culture to mine, being the Western culture.
Thank you so much. Mr. Douglas defined radical healing for each of you, starting with you, Dr. Graham. What are you doing intentionally for self-care?
Sure, I had to really learn the hard way. And so what I do is I do a lot of reflecting, right? But also I do things that I enjoy. Like Jayson said, you have to unplug. And that was very hard for me because I wanted to be extremely responsive to my students and the two other students who, who needed me on campus. But I couldn't be any good to them because I wasn't good. I was, just tired. And so what I learned to do is to unplug and be okay with unplugging. And so if that means that I turn my phone off or I shut my computer down, then that's what I do. And so what I engage in are, different creative things. I love to crochet. And so I do that, and that's very calming, and it lets me, I'm able to meditate and reflect on all that's going on. And so just taking, like Jayson said, taking time for yourselves. And we oftentimes just don't give ourselves permission to do it. But your body will certainly let you know, and you will definitely be shut down. So just taking time and just learn and being okay that I don't have to be on 24 hours a day, and just, like I said, unplugging when I need to unplug.
Dr. Ballenger?
Well, I spend time with my 11-year-old granddaughter, Peyton, and Dr. Graham knows our relationship. We are so close. And so that's how I really, really just, I don't think about my work. I don't think about my research. I don't think about my service. I just think about my precious, beautiful granddaughter, Peyton. And we go shopping, or we go to the parks, or wherever Peyton wants to go. That's where Mother Julia takes her.
Thank you. Ms. Patton?
Anyone who's ever visited my office, and if you haven't, please come see me. I'm in the library. We'll see a lot of photographs of nature all over the place. I love to explore nature. I love to take photographs, not of big, beautiful things, but of a tiny flower blossoming in the desert. I want to make sure that I am seeing the beauty in the small things. And then most recently, my most fun thing I'm doing to help me heal and to help me stay grounded. My daughter, who is leaving the Army, has purchased 2 small mini horses and is establishing a nonprofit. And we are training the mini horses to be therapy horses that she is going to take into hospices where children are critically ill or terminally ill. And what I am finding is that training those little horses is therapy for me. When you look into the eyes, and I think that's true for many people of many animals, when you look deep into the eyes of an animal, there's just, for me personally, a healing that occurs.
Thank you. Mr. Douglas?
For me, contrary to belief, I live in commerce and I love living in commerce, but I also know that sometimes I have to leave commerce. And sometimes you'll find me on Fridays at 5 p.m. and I'll be headed to the airport, and I love to travel. So I just love to get on a plane and just find, where's Southwest cheapest tickets this week? Figure out where am I going? Or my tender love of Spirit Airlines, where am I going for the Bear Fare? And I just go wherever I need to go. And sometimes that's back home and sometimes that's not home. And I go where I need to go and just really relax my mind. And I'm back here Monday morning and getting back into the groove of things. And I've really restored myself for the weekend and I'm back at it at 100%. That's what I love to do, is just travel.
Thank you. The next question was, we focused on healing through education, healing through knowledge and humility, healing through intercultural competency. What is your views towards oppressive legislations that are sweeping across the nation that seems to somehow thwart the healing process? We'll start with you, Dr. Graham, and then Ms. Patton, then Mr. Douglas, and then you, Dr. Ballenger. Dr. Graham.
I think it goes back to what we introduced in terms of, the different steps in terms of, or elements of humility, knowing your place in this world. And so it is very sad to see these oppressive policies or laws being enacted, or the attempts to do such. But then what can you do as an individual? Can you write a letter? Can you be part of an organization? Can you support your legislation? And so it's not just, it impacts the healing to a certain degree, but understanding that we're part of a larger context. And so what can you do individually, more than just talk and complain about it? Can you, put your concern into some action? And so that's what I say. I mean, the news is horrific. I stopped watching it. But bottom line is, let's stop complaining and let's becoming more active. And what can you do to, to make your feelings known, or your community's feelings known about these oppressive policies or laws? So that's kind of my take on it. Be about it. If you're concerned, then look at ways that you can help.
Ms. Patton?
I think there are two things that I find myself doing when, as we are all seeing these sorts of things are occurring. The first is the simple thing of voting. I have the right to vote, and my vote counts. And if you're passing legislation that I find repugnant, I will vote against you. But I also am not shy about mobilizing others and doing letter campaigns to people that are in a position to influence perhaps more at a high level than myself. If they get 1,000 letters in 1 week from all over the area from their constituents explaining their concerns, somebody's got to open and read all of those letters. And the hope is in mobilizing others that we are better able to impact change together than totally in isolation. So yes, my vote counts, but I don't mind getting behind either somebody else that's mobilizing or being a factor in doing the mobilizing myself.
Mr. Douglas?
I think there's a number of things that I do, but the two that stick out to me the most is my philanthropy and my service. I think that sometimes we don't recognize how, I think about a piece of legislation that came out recently and how Lyft and Salesforce got behind those who oppose the legislation, and that aligned with my belief, is that sometimes it's about giving to those organizations so that they can continue the work that they're doing. And when I say give, it might be $10, it might be $20, but that helps the movement, right? Because it's $10 or $20 that they didn't have. I can't give 200,000 now, but I can do my 10 or 20, and hopefully 10 or 20 other people give 10 or 20, and we got some money going in to help the mobilization and the work. I also think that service is a part of that. So if you're unable to be in a space where you can financially contribute and give, what about giving behind the organizations and saying, how do I need to be boots on the grounds to mobilize the efforts, to advance the work? How can I knock on doors and canvas, or how can I hold healing circles in community where we can continue the dialogue of conversation? And doing that, that's pretty much where I am, is my philanthropy and my service. And that really advances the healing process for myself.
Thank you. And Dr. Ballenger.
Right. Well, some of which, everything which the three have said, for me, it's a collective action. And certainly it's not about just one person. And I see the legislature as just one of many. I don't see that they hold that much power. And I'm so hopeful and so positive in that it's going to be overridden that I don't let that upset me. I do not, because there are some things I know that I cannot control. I focus on those things that I can control. However, those issues are really degrading and very negative. And when people, if someone asks me my opinion, I honestly let them know where I stand on the issue and why I stand on the issue. I say things like, I grew up in the Jim Crow South. I grew up, I know where they're going with that. That's where the world wants, some people want to take us back to Jim Crow. I grew up in segregated schools, water fountains for Black and for white, theaters where we sat in the upper and the whites were in the bottom, which I think the upper is a good place to be. So I do know where I am, and I don't let things like that cause me to fear. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. And while being hopeful, I work through organizations such as my sorority. We do resolutions against those oppressive laws through my church. The Christian Methodist Episcopal Church has a huge number, and we write resolutions against that, and we call our legislatures. So I do realize that there are some things I can't control, but I can influence through collective action.
To you, Dr. Ballenger, Dr. Graham, Ms. Patton, Mr. Douglas, we thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Unfortunately, we have more questions than we do time, but we do want to say thank you for sharing your knowledge with us as it relates to humility and knowledge. So thank you so much for your expertise on this day. Thank you guys so much. At this time, we have Dr. Kimberly McLeod, who will come and share with us, and then we will finish with our wrap up. Dr. McLeod.
Good afternoon, and thank you. I enjoyed listening to this panel, to Sandi Patton and Julia Ballenger, Kriss Kemp-Graham, and our partner in all of the work that we do, Jayson Douglas, and the panel before that, Mei Jing and Ali Bambino, and all of the panelists that have come together. We want to thank you for joining the College of Education and Human Services. We hope to see you again next year. Make sure you stay connected with us, because we have a lot of events coming up this fall to celebrate, to unite, to expand our efforts community-wide. We will have a State of the College luncheon coming up in October. Additionally, we're celebrating just Lion Pride with the tailgate on October 30th at our home stadium, with a nice tailgating party. And it'll be an educators event where we can recognize some of our partners on the field. We have so many other conferences that our departments are putting on, and we encourage you to stay connected, stay plugged in, grow with us, and tell other people about the good work that's happening at Texas A&M University Commerce and the College of Education and Human Services. If you can't be a part of our dynamic faculty, there's no other place to be better than in our classroom learning from them. And with that, to our faculty that have organized this event, kudos to you. I hope that I talked with Dr. Hendricks and Sherry Harwell, have a moment to come together and celebrate our second annual symposium as we look forward to our third annual symposium next year. For all of those that are attending with us, stay with us. This is just the beginning. I turn it back over to you, Dr. Hendricks.
Again, thank you so much, Dr. McLeod. I do want to duly note that the concept, the idea, the visionary to have these symposiums was orchestrated by you, Dr. McLeod, and we appreciate the leadership that you've shown here in the College of Education and Human Services by providing both the resources for us to be able to bring this to our communities and across the nation, and for that part across the world, because many are listening also from different places around the world. So thank you so much for the support that you have given. Also, I want to thank all of our panel members that shared today. Texas A&M University Commerce has some of the greatest experts in the areas, and you saw several of them today displaying their talents, displaying their knowledge. We want to encourage you to continue to reach out to us here at Texas A&M University Commerce anytime there is a need or an expert in various subject matters. You saw today, they talked about how education is going to be the healing tool. For Dr. Ballenger, Dr. Graham, Ms. Patton, Mr. Douglas, for Dr. Babineau, Dr. Rodriguez, and others this morning, they demonstrated their talents towards us. So we appreciate what you have shared. To all of the members, Dr. McLeod alluded to it a few minutes ago, that participated with this. We do have a slide to show all of the committee members. I do want to thank, again, Dr. Ballenger, Dr. Kelly Carrero, Dr. Catherine Dixon, Dr. Teresa Farley, Ms. Sherry Hardwell, Dr. Tony Lee, Dr. Martha McCarron Sierra, Dr. Joyce Miller, Dr. Laura Slade, Dr. Demetrius Smith, Dr. Tony Sturban, and Dr. Josh Thompson. I would be terribly remiss if we did not give a shout out to Dr. Thompson, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Martha McCarron. These are the individuals who are behind the scenes technologically making everything move smoothly. So thank you to all of you who came to participate and be a part of this. I mentioned earlier when we began that we're asking you also to conduct the survey that we have for you. We want to improve each and every year. You can see on the screen there, you can do the exit survey by using the QR chip there. And also, if you can over to the right, the symposium that's being recorded, you can use that as well. But we also encourage you to donate towards the College of Education and Human Services. We have several ways that you can donate. Please log in on the QR chip, because it is through your donations, through your support, that we continue to provide quality programs of this nature. Want to remind you of what I learned many, many years ago. A writer once says, 2 roads diverged into a yellow wood, and I, being only one traveler, looked down one as far as I could to where it bent under the undergrowth. I shall be telling this story some ages hence. 2 roads diverged into a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Many years ago in grade number 7, I learned this poem entitled The Road Less Taken by Robert Frost. We truly believe here at Texas A&M University Commerce that education is going to be what we use to heal the ills of society. Again, thank you for being here with us. We wish you a great day and a great weekend.